How much is a human heart worth when the people who should love it decide to sell it? The question lingered silently in the cool morning air as Grace Bennet stood outside the weathered gates of the family estate with only a small cloth bag resting against her shoulder, and the silver pendant her late mother had placed around her neck many years before. She was only 22 years old, a quiet omega whose gentle nature had never protected her from the bitterness growing inside the home she once believed would always welcome her. Across the stone courtyard, her stepmother Victoria Bennet counted a heavy pouch of gold coins one piece at a time. Every soft metallic sound echoed like another door quietly closing behind Grace. Two royal escorts waited patiently beside a polished black carriage marked with the crest of the Alpha King. Their uniforms were immaculate, their expressions respectful, and neither man seemed comfortable watching the exchange taking place before them. Victoria finally tightened the pouch and smiled with obvious satisfaction. "Everything has been settled," she announced. "Take the girl." Grace lowered her eyes for only a moment before lifting them again. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply held the silver pendant resting against her heart, remembering the final words her mother had whispered years ago. "Never let anyone decide your worth for you." Those words had carried her through every lonely season since. One of the royal escorts stepped forward and spoke with surprising kindness. "Miss Bennet, the carriage is ready whenever you are." Grace offered him a small grateful smile. "Thank you." Her calm response seemed to surprise everyone standing nearby. Victoria folded her arms. "You should be grateful. You are going to serve inside the royal palace. Most girls from this village would envy such an opportunity." Grace looked around the familiar courtyard one last time. The climbing roses her mother once cared for still reached across the old stone wall. The oak tree beneath which she had spent countless summer afternoons still stretched toward the bright blue sky. Even after everything that had happened, she silently wished the house would someday become a place filled with peace instead of resentment. As she walked toward the carriage, she noticed one of the younger servants struggling to carry a heavy wooden crate filled with vegetables. Without hesitation, Grace set down her own bag and helped lift the crate onto the wagon waiting nearby. "Thank you," the servant whispered, clearly embarrassed. Grace smiled gently. "We all need someone to make the load a little lighter sometimes." One of the royal escorts quietly watched the exchange before opening the carriage door for her. The journey began beneath warm autumn sunlight as rolling hills slowly replaced the village behind them. Grace sat quietly beside the window, watching fields of golden wheat sway beneath the gentle breeze while keeping one hand wrapped around her mother's pendant. Across from her sat a man dressed in an ordinary dark traveling cloak. His posture was relaxed, and an old leather-bound book rested in his hands. He appeared to be just another traveler sharing the road toward the capital, yet his calm silver eyes briefly lifted from the page when he noticed Grace offering her drinking water to another weary passenger whose canteen had run dry. She asked for nothing in return. The stranger observed the simple act without speaking before quietly closing his book and looking out toward the distant mountains, as though the journey ahead had suddenly become far more important than anyone inside the carriage yet realized. The carriage rolled steadily along the winding royal road as the village disappeared beyond gentle hills washed in warm autumn light. Grace remained quietly seated near the window, her mother's silver pendant resting against her heart, while distant forests painted the horizon in shades of emerald and gold. Every mile carried her farther from the only home she had ever known, yet she refused to allow sorrow to harden the kindness that had always guided her. The elderly woman sitting across from her struggled to keep a small basket balanced as the carriage crossed a rough stretch of road. Before anyone else noticed, Grace leaned forward and steadied the basket with both hands. Fresh apples remained safely inside, and the woman released a grateful sigh. "Thank you, dear," she whispered warmly. Grace smiled with quiet sincerity. "My mother used to say that helping someone costs less than regretting that we did not." The old woman nodded thoughtfully while the other passengers exchanged silent glances. One of the royal escorts riding beside the carriage looked through the open window and quietly observed the exchange without interrupting. A short time later the horses slowed beside a clear mountain spring where travelers often paused to rest. The escort stepped away to refill water containers while passengers stretched beneath towering pine trees, whose branches swayed gently in the crisp breeze. Grace noticed a young stable boy struggling to calm one of the horses after its bridle became tangled against a low branch. She approached slowly, speaking in a gentle voice until the nervous animal relaxed enough for the boy to free the leather strap. "You have a gift with animals," he said with obvious admiration. Grace softly shook her head. "They simply feel safer when someone is patient." As everyone prepared to continue the journey, she quietly divided the last pieces of bread inside her small cloth bag, offering half to the stable boy and the other half to an elderly traveler who admitted he had forgotten to pack food before leaving home. She kept only a small piece for herself without the slightest hesitation. From the opposite side of the resting area, the quiet traveler wearing the dark cloak watched every small act with thoughtful attention. His weathered book remained closed in one hand while his silver eyes followed Grace as she moved naturally from one person to another, never expecting recognition for anything she did. She never complained about her own uncertain future. She never mentioned the pain of leaving home. Instead, she noticed everyone else's burdens before her own. The traveler slowly walked toward the spring and filled a wooden cup with fresh water before returning to the carriage. As Grace stepped inside, he quietly offered her the cup. "You have spent the morning making certain everyone else was cared for," he said calmly. "You should not forget yourself." Grace accepted the water with grateful surprise. "Thank you." Their eyes met only briefly before the stranger offered a polite nod and returned to his seat without another word. The carriage continued toward the capital beneath an endless blue sky as golden sunlight shimmered across distant rivers. Grace watched the passing landscape with quiet hope, unaware that the man who had just shown her simple courtesy had been carefully observing every choice she made since the journey began. And with every passing mile he became more certain that the story he had been told about the young Omega could not possibly be the truth. By late afternoon the distant outline of the royal capital slowly emerged beyond rolling hills, its white stone towers rising above the forest like sunlight resting upon the mountains. Grace watched quietly through the carriage window as the road widened into a broad avenue lined with ancient oak trees whose golden leaves drifted gently across the path. Travelers became more numerous with every passing mile. Merchants guided wagons filled with colorful fabrics and baskets of fruit. Families laughed as they walked toward the city gates, and royal banners fluttered proudly above every watchtower. The closer they came, the more Grace wondered what kind of life waited beyond those towering walls. She had been told she was being delivered as property, yet nothing about the journey matched the cruelty she had imagined. The royal escorts had spoken respectfully. The passengers had shown unexpected kindness. Even the quiet traveler wearing the dark cloak had treated her with simple dignity that asked for nothing in return. The carriage eventually slowed behind a line of arriving wagons waiting for inspection outside the capital gates. While everyone remained seated, Grace noticed a little boy standing beside his father struggling to gather several apples that had rolled across the road after one of the wagon wheels struck a loose stone. Without hesitation she stepped down from the carriage after receiving a polite nod from one of the escorts. She carefully collected the scattered fruit before handing the basket back to the grateful family. "Thank you, miss," the father said warmly. Grace answered with the same gentle smile she had offered everyone throughout the journey. "I hope your market day goes well." Nearby, the cloaked traveler watched the exchange once again. There was no audience to impress and no reward waiting for her, yet kindness seemed as natural to Grace as breathing itself. He slowly closed his weathered book and rested it beside him, studying the silver pendant around her neck as sunlight reflected softly across its delicate surface. It looked old, carefully preserved, and deeply treasured. When Grace returned to the carriage, she quietly apologized to the escort for delaying the line. The older guard smiled reassuringly. A few extra moments spent helping someone are rarely wasted. She lowered her eyes modestly before taking her seat once more. The gates finally opened with a deep echo that rolled across the valley. Massive white walls surrounded elegant streets filled with flowering gardens, graceful fountains, and magnificent stone buildings unlike anything Grace had ever seen. As the carriage entered the capital, citizens paused to bow respectfully toward the royal crest displayed upon the escort horses, though none of them paid particular attention to the ordinary young Omega riding quietly inside. Grace felt both amazed and uncertain as she admired the beautiful city through wide, curious eyes. Across from her, the cloaked traveler looked toward the towering palace rising above the capital's skyline. A faint, thoughtful smile crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. He adjusted the hood covering part of his features while the carriage continued climbing toward the palace gates. Grace noticed several noble families already gathering outside the grand entrance, their elegant clothing shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. She quietly tightened her hand around her mother's pendant, unaware that within the next few moments the stranger who had shared the journey beside her would step forward, remove his cloak before the entire royal court, and reveal a truth capable of changing the course of her life forever. The carriage came to a gentle stop beneath the towering marble archway of the royal palace as rows of white banners bearing the ancient wolf crest moved gracefully in the afternoon breeze. Grace stepped onto the polished stone courtyard with her small cloth bag resting against one shoulder, and her mother's silver pendant shining softly beneath the warm sunlight. Around her, nobles dressed in elegant robes gathered near the grand entrance, speaking in quiet voices until their attention settled upon the young Omega escorted from the carriage. Curious whispers quickly spread through the crowd. So this is the girl they purchased. She hardly looks worthy of entering the palace. Grace heard every word, yet she neither lowered her head in shame nor answered with resentment. She simply continued walking with calm dignity, her woven kindness remaining untouched by the opinions surrounding her. One elderly palace servant accidentally dropped a stack of folded linens while hurrying across the courtyard. Before any guard or noble reacted, Grace bent down and carefully gathered every piece before returning them with both hands. "Thank you, miss," the servant said with grateful surprise. Grace smiled gently. Everyone deserves a little help when their hands are full. Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected fear, bitterness, perhaps even desperation. Instead, they witnessed quiet grace that could not be taught by wealth or titles. Standing several steps behind the gathering, the traveler wearing the dark cloak calmly observed the entire exchange without speaking. His weathered book remained tucked beneath one arm while his silver eyes followed Grace's every action. She never sought attention. She simply noticed those everyone else overlooked. A royal chamberlain approached the cloaked traveler and respectfully lowered his head. "Everything is prepared, your." Before the title could be completed, the traveler raised one subtle hand, asking for silence. The chamberlain immediately understood and stepped back without another word. Grace remained unaware of the quiet exchange as she admired the magnificent palace rising before her. Towering white columns supported soaring balconies covered with flowering vines, while crystal fountains reflected the golden afternoon light across polished marble paths. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, yet she felt strangely small standing among people whose elegant clothing and confident smiles reminded her that she did not truly belong. The great bronze doors slowly opened, revealing the enormous royal hall beyond. Noble families entered first while palace officials took their assigned places along the walls. Grace quietly followed the escorts toward the center of the chamber, where the magnificent throne stood upon a broad platform beneath a brilliant stained glass skylight. Soft murmurs filled the hall as more guests arrived. Then, without warning, the quiet traveler stepped past everyone else and began walking toward the throne. Confused whispers immediately spread through the room. Grace watched in surprise as royal guards lining both sides of the hall suddenly lowered themselves onto one knee. One after another, council members, nobles, servants, and officials followed until the entire chamber stood in complete respectful silence. The traveler calmly reached for the edge of his dark cloak and drew it back from his shoulders. Sunlight illuminated his sharp features, shoulder-length dark hair, and unmistakable silver eyes. A palace herald took one step forward and announced in a voice that echoed throughout the hall, "His Majesty, Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks." Grace felt her breath catch as she realized the quiet man who had shared bread, offered her water, and watched her kindness throughout the journey had never been an ordinary traveler at all. And as the Alpha King turned toward her with a calm, thoughtful expression, every voice inside the royal hall fell completely silent. The silence inside the royal hall lingered long after the herald announced the Alpha King's name. Grace remained standing exactly where the royal escorts had left her, her fingers resting lightly against the silver pendant beneath her collar, while hundreds of eyes studied every movement she made. Nathaniel Brooks descended the broad marble steps leading from the throne with the same quiet composure he had shown throughout the journey. He neither hurried nor paused for dramatic effect. His calm presence alone seemed to steady the enormous chamber. When he reached Grace, he offered a respectful nod instead of looking down upon her. "Miss Bennet," he said warmly, Thank you for your kindness during our journey. Grace blinked in surprise before lowering her head slightly. Your Majesty, I did not know who you were. A faint smile appeared in his eyes. That is precisely why your actions mattered. The nobles exchanged puzzled glances. One council member stepped forward with a carefully measured expression. Your Majesty, according to the documents delivered this morning, the young woman was legally transferred to the crown under the authority of her guardian. Nathaniel accepted the parchment from the chamberlain without comment. He read every line slowly before folding the document with deliberate care. Who prepared these records? He asked. The chamberlain answered respectfully. They were submitted by Victoria Bennet together with declarations regarding inheritance and guardianship. Nathaniel turned his attention toward Grace. Did you sign any agreement willingly? Grace answered honestly. No, Your Majesty. I was only told that I no longer belonged in my own home. The hall became noticeably quieter. Nathaniel looked toward the royal archivist standing beside shelves filled with ancient ledgers. Bring me the Bennet family inheritance records, the original guardianship filings, and every land registry associated with that estate. The archivist bowed immediately before disappearing through a side doorway. Several nobles shifted uneasily. One of them attempted a polite objection. Your Majesty, perhaps such matters can wait until tomorrow. Nathaniel calmly shook his head. Truth loses nothing by being examined today. His voice never rose, yet no one questioned him again. While attendants gathered the requested records, Grace quietly noticed a young palace page struggling to carry a stack of heavy books across the polished floor. Without thinking about where she stood or who was watching, she stepped forward and helped steady the pile before the books could fall. Thank you, the embarrassed page whispered. Grace smiled gently. We all need an extra pair of hands sometimes. Nathaniel observed the simple moment with thoughtful silence. Even surrounded by marble pillars, jeweled crowns, and the highest nobles in the kingdom, Grace's first instinct remained helping someone else. Minutes later, the archivist returned carrying several weathered volumes wrapped in protective cloth. Nathaniel opened the oldest ledger and carefully compared its entries with the documents submitted that morning. His silver eyes moved steadily across each page before stopping on a particular line. He read it once more, then looked toward the council with unmistakable certainty. These records do not agree. A quiet wave of surprise spread across the chamber. The archivist adjusted his spectacles before leaning closer. Your Majesty, the original inheritance identifies Grace Bennet as the sole lawful heir to the Bennet estate. Nathaniel closed the ledger gently. Then someone altered the story long before she entered this palace. Every noble in the hall fell silent once again as the Alpha King's gaze lifted from the ancient records to the great entrance doors, where royal guards had just announced that Victoria Bennet had arrived in response to the royal summons. The great bronze doors slowly opened, and Victoria Bennet entered the royal hall with measured confidence, dressed in elegant clothing that reflected the wealth she had claimed was rightfully hers. The moment she noticed Grace standing beside the Alpha King, surprise flashed across her face before quickly disappearing behind a practiced smile. She lowered herself into a respectful bow. Your Majesty, she said politely, I came as soon as I received your summons. Nathaniel Brooks acknowledged her with a calm nod. Thank you for coming. His steady voice carried across the chamber without effort. There are several matters concerning the Bennet estate that require clarification. Victoria lifted her head with apparent confidence. Of course, Your Majesty. I have always acted in accordance with the law. The Alpha King quietly opened the weathered inheritance ledger once again and rested it upon the marble table. That is precisely what I wish to discuss. He turned the ancient pages until they reached the original registry prepared years before Grace's mother had passed away. According to these records, the estate and every legal right attached to it belonged to Grace Bennet. The council members leaned forward as the royal archivist carefully confirmed the document's authenticity. Victoria hesitated for the first time. There must be some misunderstanding, she replied. Nathaniel looked toward the archivist. Please continue. The elderly scholar adjusted his spectacles before reading aloud. The original guardianship granted temporary care only. Ownership of the estate and inheritance remained reserved for Grace Bennet upon reaching adulthood. Quiet whispers spread through the chamber. Nathaniel then unfolded the more recent papers submitted to the Crown. These documents describe Grace as having surrendered every right voluntarily. His silver eyes rested calmly upon Victoria. "Can you explain how that happened?" Victoria drew a slow breath. She agreed. Nathaniel turned toward Grace. "Did you ever sign these documents?" Grace gently shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. No one ever presented them to me." The Alpha King remained silent for several thoughtful moments before speaking again. "Then the truth deserves to be heard completely." A royal clerk stepped forward carrying additional correspondence recently collected from the Bennett estate. Among the papers rested letters, financial records, and witness statements gathered during the afternoon investigation. One by one they confirmed that Grace had never been informed of her inheritance and had never authorized the transfer of her property or legal status. The hall became so quiet that the gentle crackling of the great fireplace echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes, realizing the carefully constructed story could no longer withstand the official records. Throughout the entire exchange, Grace remained remarkably composed. She neither celebrated the discoveries nor looked toward her stepmother with bitterness. Instead, she quietly approached the elderly archivist. After noticing several heavy ledgers slipping from the edge of the table, before they could fall, she steadied the books with both hands and helped arrange them carefully. The archivist smiled gratefully. "Even now you think first about helping someone else." Grace answered softly. It seemed like the right thing to do. Nathaniel watched the simple gesture with quiet admiration. He realized that not even the possibility of recovering everything that had been taken from her had changed the kindness she carried so naturally. He slowly closed the inheritance ledger before addressing the entire royal hall. "From this moment forward," he declared calmly, "Grace Bennett will not be regarded as property, servant, or obligation. Until every legal matter is fully resolved, she will remain under the personal protection of the Crown." The nobles exchanged astonished glances, yet no one spoke against the decision. As warm evening light poured through the stained glass windows, Nathaniel looked toward Grace with unmistakable respect, and everyone present sensed that his promise marked not the end of her story, but the beginning of something far greater than anyone inside the hall had yet imagined. Morning sunlight gradually filled the royal hall as the previous evening's discoveries settled into quiet certainty throughout the palace. News of the restored inheritance had already reached every corridor, yet the conversation among nobles was no longer centered upon lost property. Instead, they spoke about the remarkable composure of the young Omega, who had entered the palace carrying nothing more than a small cloth bag and a silver pendant. Grace remained exactly the same despite everything that had changed around her. She greeted every palace servant with a warm smile, thanked the attendants who prepared breakfast, and quietly helped an elderly librarian organize several heavy volumes before anyone thought to ask for assistance. Her kindness had not grown because people were finally treating her with respect. It had always been there. Nathaniel Brooks observed these quiet moments from a respectful distance. He had ruled the kingdom long enough to recognize that character revealed itself most clearly through ordinary choices. Grace never looked around to see who might be watching. She simply noticed where help was needed and offered it without hesitation. Later that morning the royal hall welcomed council members, regional alphas, scholars, and noble families who had requested permission to witness the official conclusion of the Bennett inheritance inquiry. Victoria Bennett stood quietly before the council table with lowered eyes while the royal archivist carefully summarized every verified document collected during the investigation. Each record confirmed the same conclusion. Grace had remained the lawful heir from the very beginning. The council unanimously acknowledged the findings, and the chamber fell silent once the final document received the royal seal. Nathaniel slowly rose from his chair and looked across the gathering. "Today," he said calmly, "the truth has been restored." His voice remained gentle, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. No person should ever lose dignity because another chooses deception. Justice exists to restore what honesty deserves. He then turned toward Grace, who stood quietly beside the marble staircase with her familiar pendant resting against her heart. "Miss Bennett," he continued, "from this day forward, no one within this kingdom will address you as property, servant, or burden." The silence inside the hall deepened even further. Nathaniel allowed the words to settle before adding, "Anyone who speaks of her in that manner will be speaking against the judgment of the crown itself." A quiet wave of realization spread through the nobles. Several individuals who had whispered dismissive remarks the previous day now lowered their eyes with visible embarrassment. Grace did not respond with satisfaction. Instead, she gently inclined her head toward the Alpha King. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said softly. "I only wished for the truth to find its proper place." Nathaniel smiled with genuine admiration. "And that is precisely why you deserve to be heard." As the formal gathering came to an end, one of the youngest palace attendants accidentally dropped a polished silver tray near the entrance. Before anyone else moved, Grace stepped forward and helped gather every cup before they could roll across the marble floor. The frightened attendant looked ready to apologize repeatedly, but Grace simply smiled. Everyone has moments like this. Several council members quietly watched the exchange, recognizing that the same humility Grace had shown as an unknown traveler remained unchanged after receiving royal protection. Nathaniel noticed their expressions and understood that no speech could have demonstrated her character more clearly than that single ordinary moment. Standing before the entire court, he realized there was one final truth that still belonged to the future, and as he looked toward Grace with calm certainty, many inside the royal hall sensed that the greatest announcement had not yet been spoken. The royal hall remained completely still as the final words of the Alpha King's judgment settled beneath the towering stained glass ceiling. Warm afternoon light poured across polished marble floors, reflecting countless colors that seemed to soften every solemn face gathered inside the chamber. Grace stood quietly with her silver pendant resting against her heart, believing the greatest surprise of her life had already passed. She had regained the truth of her family's inheritance. She had been treated with dignity instead of shame. She expected nothing more. Nathaniel Brooks slowly descended the marble steps once again, his calm silver eyes never leaving hers. Every movement carried quiet confidence rather than ceremony. When he stopped before Grace, he spoke gently enough that she alone could have heard him, yet the silence surrounding them allowed every word to reach the farthest corner of the hall. "Throughout this journey," he said, "I watched how you treated strangers before you knew anyone was watching. I watched you share your food when you had little for yourself. I watched you comfort frightened travelers, help weary servants, and show respect to every person you met regardless of their title." Grace lowered her eyes modestly. "I only did what I believed was right, Your Majesty." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Exactly." He slowly turned toward the gathered council, noble families, royal officers, and palace attendants. "Many people believe greatness begins with power," he said. "I have learned that true greatness begins with character." The chamber remained silent as every noble listened carefully. Nathaniel continued, "A crown may be inherited. Authority may be granted. Wealth may be gained or lost. But compassion cannot be borrowed, and dignity cannot be purchased." His words settled gently over the gathering before he looked back toward Grace. "Miss Bennet, you entered this palace believing you had been reduced to property. Yet every choice you made revealed something entirely different." Grace felt her heart beat faster, uncertain where his words were leading. Nathaniel extended his hand toward her with quiet respect instead of command. She hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The entire royal hall seemed to hold its breath. "I will not allow anyone in this kingdom to define your worth by the lies that were spoken about you," Nathaniel declared calmly. "Nor will I allow anyone to believe that compassion is weakness." He looked across the gathered court with unwavering certainty. From this day forward, Grace Bennet will never again stand in this palace as someone protected merely by the crown. A quiet wave of anticipation swept through the nobles. Nathaniel gently lifted Grace's hand. "She stands beside me because I recognize the qualities that every Luna should possess. Courage without pride. Kindness without expectation. Strength without cruelty. Wisdom without vanity." His silver eyes met Grace's once more. "Before all who witness this day, I openly acknowledge Grace Bennet as my chosen Luna." For one breathtaking moment, absolute silence filled the royal hall. Then one royal guard slowly placed a hand across his chest. Another followed. Council members respectfully bowed their heads. Palace servants smiled through grateful tears. Even the oldest nobles who had questioned Grace only hours earlier now lowered themselves in respectful acknowledgement. Grace stood speechless, overwhelmed not by the grandeur of the announcement but by the quiet sincerity in Nathaniel's eyes. He had not spoken from pity. He had spoken from conviction. As warm sunlight illuminated the silver pendant resting against her heart, Grace realized that the words her mother had whispered long ago had finally come true. No one had been able to decide her worth after all, because her true value had always been waiting for someone wise enough to see it. Several months later, the kingdom had quietly changed in ways that no decree alone could have accomplished. Throughout villages, market towns, and distant mountain packs, people spoke less about the young Omega who had been brought to the palace under false pretenses and more about the Luna whose kindness had reminded an entire realm what true strength looked like. Grace herself remained unchanged. Each morning she still walked through the palace gardens before sunrise, greeting gardeners by name, carrying fresh flowers to the royal chapel, and thanking every servant whose work often went unnoticed. She continued wearing the silver pendant her mother had left her, not because she wished to remember her sorrow, but because it reminded her that hope could survive even the hardest seasons. Nathaniel Brooks often watched these quiet moments from a respectful distance. He had chosen Grace because of the person she already was, not because of the title she would one day hold. Together they visited orphanages, farming villages, and remote packs where they listened far more than they spoke. Grace never entered a home expecting admiration. She sat beside elderly widows, shared meals with children, and thanked hardworking families for welcoming them. The people quickly realized that their Luna measured greatness by compassion instead of status. One peaceful afternoon they returned to the Bennett estate, where legal ownership had finally been restored to Grace exactly as the original records intended. The old stone house stood beneath the same oak tree where she had once played as a little girl. Roses once neglected had begun blooming again along the garden wall. Grace walked slowly through the familiar courtyard before gently touching the weathered gate. She felt no desire for revenge and no satisfaction in another person's downfall. She simply felt grateful that the truth had finally found its rightful place. Nathaniel quietly joined her beneath the old oak tree. "Do you regret coming back?" he asked gently. Grace smiled as a cool breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the hillside. "No," she answered softly, "because this place no longer reminds me of what was taken from me. It reminds me of everything that remained inside me, even when I believed I had nothing." Nathaniel nodded with quiet admiration. "That is why you became my Luna." As the afternoon sun settled across the valley, several children from the nearby village ran toward the estate carrying baskets filled with fresh apples. They stopped shyly before Grace, offering the fruit with bright, hopeful smiles. "Welcome home, Lady Grace," one little girl whispered. Grace accepted the gift with grateful hands before kneeling to thank every child individually. Nathaniel watched the scene with a peaceful smile, recognizing the same quiet kindness he had first witnessed inside the traveling carriage. It had never depended upon wealth, safety, or recognition. It had simply been the truest part of her heart. As evening arrived, Grace and Nathaniel stood together overlooking fields glowing beneath the golden sunset while church bells echoed softly from the distant village. She slipped her hand into his, not because a crown had changed her future, but because trust had been earned through patience, honesty, and respect. Above them the first stars appeared one by one across the darkening sky, and Grace realized her mother had been right all along. No one could decide another person's worth. The world might misunderstand it for a time, hide it behind lies, or attempt to trade it for gold, but genuine character always finds its way into the light. And in a kingdom where an alpha king chose compassion before judgment, and a Luna answered every hardship with grace, people would remember that the greatest legacy any heart could leave behind was not power, but kindness that continued long after every title had faded.